Hi everyone, my name is Shapur, and today I'm delighted to be joined here at Australian property market analyst by Scott O'Neill, whose property investment success story has become quite viral in the media. Scott and his partner purchased their first property back in 2010 with the $60,000 they earned from various student jobs. But they have reached now an impressive portfolio of $47 million in value, and currently there are 26 properties, deliver them more than $2 million in gross rents each year, which well shows why young Scott has retired himself at the age of 28. Scott and his partner also wrote their bestseller book, Rethink Property Investing, last year, and they have their own buyers advocacy in the field of commercial as well. That's what they're busy on a daily basis with in the Australian market. Hi, Scott. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, Shapur. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Scott, there's a lot to talk about, but I don't want to take up your time. I know you're on a trip. When I reviewed your ideas on the net, in your book, or through your videos and podcasts, I get the impression that commercial property is, in general terms, a better option than residential property. It seems to be advocated, correct me if I'm wrong, okay? It seems to be advocated as a panacea, as a cure-all. So you mentioned that property investment, like any other business, has to be positive cash flow, okay? And with the current interest rates and property prices, most property investment turns out to be negatively geared. So what I have gathered from your ideas is the commercial property, because it is inherently of a higher rental yield, should be preferred over residential. Is that a right understanding of you or no?
Look, in general, yes. Like, there's obviously exceptions to every case, but I'm an engineer by background, so I follow the numbers. My father was an accountant, so like numbers should be the main reason to make decisions on investment. So if the numbers don't make sense, then you've got to look elsewhere. And that's what I think the residential markets have failed to keep up with. Because 40 years ago, you could get a positively geared residential property in most capital cities. And all this price growth has outstripped the rental growth for a long term. Like, the loans have got larger. The numbers aren't making as sense as much as we'd like them to do in residential. So I found out that the hard way when I was building my personal portfolio. I started in residential like most people, and I got to a point where it was just getting too hard with the banks. The banks were saying no more loans, no more purchasing. We don't like the look of your portfolio. All of a sudden, it wasn't looking like a good business because it was relying on myself to work harder and get a pay rise to support the portfolio. And if you're trying to retire from property, you can't support it. It's got to support you. So it kind of, the actions from the banks spoke for themselves. Like, this is not a solution to keep following. And, the diehard residential investors will say, oh, look, you just got to hold on to it, pay the debt off, wait for growth. And that's decades, a lot of us don't have 20 years to spare to, just wait for this magical rental growth to all of a sudden get so big you're going to pay all your loans off. And it will in time, but there are faster solutions. And that's where I was led to commercial, because I was just Googling and looking at some warehouses and some, little medical centers, numbers of years ago. And I just looked at the rents and I thought, this is almost too good to be true. Like, it's almost triple the return and for the price on a net basis. Why is no one looking at this? Why is this not in the media every day like there is with the residential coverage? And I just couldn't get my head around it. So I actually looked for about 2 years before buying a commercial property, like researched as much as I could, spoke to, I reckon, over 1,000 different agents in that time. And the numbers stacked up. They are what they are. And then once I started talking to the banks, that's when the light bulb moment went off, because I realized there's different lending criteria. You're dealing with a different section of the bank. So because of that, I could get a loan where I couldn't in residential. So that was sort of where I left residential personally at that point.
Most of the time when you speak to property advisors like myself, we would have a strategic mindset defined in terms of diversification. We would advise people to have a diversity of different properties, but when it comes to you, facts and figures are more important, and this diversification. And to you, figures sort of boil down to a matter of cash flow, right?
Yeah, and to be clear, Shapur, you do need residential. I think it is a very important starting point, and the main reason is barrier to entry. If you wait to save up a 30% deposit, which is what you need for commercial, it
Exactly.
can take too long. So if you do not have the capital, then residential is an easy leveraging method. You're going to get especially if you have time on your side and you've got a job and you're not trying to retire next year, residential will give you that access into the markets. And then hypothetically speaking, you get some growth out of those residential properties, maybe 5 years pass, you can then leverage off that, and that can be the deposit for a commercial down the track. My main message is you just don't keep going to residential after residential. Like you see these guys in the media say, oh, I've got 50, houses in working class areas. That to me is like, it's almost like childish in a way. You're just collecting houses and you're not really looking at the bigger picture. Is this going to solve my retirement problem, or am I just buying a house because I can? There's a few of that type of stuff going on in the media, but I'm a big advocate. Start in residential because it is lower risk, and this is the other thing. Like commercial is more specialized. You've got to know what you're going to do. The returns are higher, but if you get it wrong, you will get punished for it.
Yeah, of course, the stakes are higher, right? Scott, we know with commercial property, naturally, higher yields come with longer leases, but there's also the risk of long vacancies with commercial property. So, is vacancy avoidable at all? Are there any bits of information that we need to gather before venturing into commercial property with regards to asset selection, with regards to the lease quality, with regards to contracting and management, things that would possibly give us this I can say, comfort zone with regards to vacancies?
Yes, and it's a good point you raise because one of the benefits I have because of I help people purchase properties all the time is we understand the leasing market. So off the top of my head, I can tell you where there are longer leasing periods than others, and this is quite hard to get if you're just coming cold into this space for the first time. So a tip is you talk to local leasing managers. Realize that some competitor leasing managers might have vested interest to talk down the possibility of finding a tenant quickly. So if they know, let's say Colliers is knowing that CBRE's got a property down the street, of course they're not going to speak highly of it. But a tip is find out what similar vacancies have been sitting on the market and then compare like for like products. So if you've got a retail shop front in a back alley, that does not compare to a corner main road exposure. So even though they might be within 20 meters of each other, there's a very different tenancy outcome because of the quality location of the corner block versus the back alley. So it's almost like a bit of common sense. Well, I think it's common sense comes into it to say, would a business succeed or want to be in this location? We all shop. We all spend a lot of time in properties. It can be a little bit harder to get your head around like industrial assets and more specialist products like that. But yeah, you're talking to the leasing managers because your vacancies will be longer because your tenant pool is less. But in general, the tenants stay a lot longer. So the way I look at it is like our average tenant might stay for 10 years in commercial. You might have an 18-month turnover in residential, and there might be 2 or 3 weeks every time there's a vacant period. So if you sort of average that out over a 10-year period, your 3 to 4 month vacancy that you might get in commercial is actually not as bad when you spread it out over a longer period. You just got to look at things from a holistic point of view. That's the best way to make a decision.
Fair enough, absolutely. Scott, on the other hand, in commercial property investment field, we know capital growth and rental income are so closely interwoven. That is, if there is a good rental income, there's going to be capital growth. I mean, you're reassured to some degree that you're going to have capital growth as well. But at the same time, if, for example, you have a warehouse and that warehouse is under rented, most probably your investment is doomed to failure or to have capital depreciation as well. Is there any way we can go about this link between rentability or rental yield and capital growth, and how we can sort of protect ourselves against this?
Yeah, so it's a good point you bring up because I look for properties that are under rented because what that means is we can buy it at a repressed price. So let's say you're buying in an area where the capitalization rate is 6%. So what that means is if you've got 60 grand of rent, it's worth $1 million. A capitalization rate of 50,000 in a 5% cap rate, that'll be $1 million for that 50 grand rent. So like you said, the rent is closely tied to the value. So if I can find a property where I can boost the rent by 10 grand because it's either under rented, it's just a lease negotiation. It's a bit of paper and a few phone calls. If you can increase the rent by 10 grand, for example, and there's a 6% yield on that property, that 10 grand capitalized actually works out to be $166,000. So 10 grand of income annually is 166. That's a really easy way of boosting equity without having to do developments or subdivisions or anything crazy or long or costly. It's literally it might cost a couple of grand to get the lease paperwork sorted. So we like properties that you can boost the rents, and also like this is to sort of go back to your question about like vacancy rates and understanding the leasing period. I'll use industrial property as an example. Right now in Australia, the average vacancy rate is 0.8%, which is the lowest in the entire developed world right now. And we've got a massive shortage of warehouses. So the byproduct of this is there's rapid capital growth happening via rental increases. So they're predicting some areas of like Brisbane to have 50% rent growth in the next 5 years just because there's nothing available. Like all the tenants, because they've been done so well since COVID hit, online orders and manufacturing online's boosting in our local markets as well. So people need storage and there's no room for it. So they've got like tenants are overflowing into their neighboring properties if they can, or there's, taking the spare shed down the road. So that's causing rental growth and that's really good for capital growth. So I really like investing in periods like this because I know in 5 years' time the rent's going to be much higher. So it's almost nothing's guaranteed in investing ever, but it's as close to being guaranteed capital growth as you can because of the rapid income growth we're getting out of it. And even with these rate rises we're experiencing at the moment, that's a short-term impact that we all knew that was coming. It's probably come quicker than we thought. It's probably shocked a few investors, and I'm personally seeing a lot more residential investors flee residential because they have this cash flow situation that they need to offset it somehow, and commercial is a bit of a default move at the moment. So there's a lot of interesting things happening, but the demand is very high, and that's still pushing prices up.
Exactly. Thank you. Many experts, working in the field of commercial property, believe that both capital growth on the one hand and price falls can be quite significant with commercial property. You got to know what asset you're buying and where to buy and what features to focus on to be successful in commercial property. My first question is, would you agree with this thing? And if you do, what are the most important, the three major factors that investors should keep in mind when they purchase commercial property so that this doesn't happen to them? The price fall.
Yeah, look, I think in general, I don't agree with that comment. But in very isolated cases, yes, there can be greater fluctuations between individual assets. And the reason for that is I guess it's the whole, if you don't know what you're doing, you might overpay for an asset. So you can see outliers like that where someone pays way too much and then, they get punished at the back end of their sale. But commercial property is a very low debt world. People forget that most properties, I think I was talking to a mortgage broker, they were saying, and this is not a verified source, and it's very hard to get this information, but they were sort of guessing it's less than 25% debt overall in the commercial world. So there's most of the sellers that we're buying from as a buyer's agency are, I'm generalizing again, but they might be an over 65-year-old person that's owned the property for quite a long time. They've got no debt and they're selling because they're clearing out affairs. There's obviously divorces here or there. But there's never a guy with a 90% loan on a commercial because that's physically impossible. So that low debt world means there's a bit of stability in good markets. But if you've got a poor quality asset, maybe the town got bypassed on a highway, maybe you've overpaid for a property that's can't be relet. Like an example might be, imagine you bought, I don't know, some type of childcare that wasn't really a good location for a childcare. It's then got to go back to a house price without the rental, growth in it, or the value of the lease is gone. So if you overpay for a lease, then that's where those kind of comments are true, you mentioned. But like a good quality industrial asset or, a prime retail position, like it's always going to be protected because there's another tenant ready to take over the lease. So my biggest tip is make sure you can re-tenant the property. And if you can, you're protected from any of those kind of negative side effects you mentioned.
Exactly. And as a buffer, we can advise people not to go with rental contracts with short notices, because most of the time long vacancies are caused by short notice lease. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. If you don't have much time to prepare for finding a new tenant, that's obviously going to hurt you because I like to think you could get up to 2 years notice from a tenant leaving. Like, because you got to talk to these guys. You're dealing with business people, and that's why I like it. I got a little bit tired dealing with, tenants that don't know what they're doing next month. I like dealing with businesses because they can be a lot more predictable. Like they've got sometimes their own shareholders, or they've got their own branding, their own reputation to uphold. So they do look after the property because it's their brand. And they've almost got more risk in a property than you do sometimes as well. So it's a much more balanced conversation when you deal with them. And I was for a client I called up this week. They bought a medical property and they were sort of wondering if their tenant was going to leave. They were quite nervous. So we just spoke to, it was a government tenant. We spoke to the department in the government, and they don't show all their cards, of course, because they're the government and they don't want to. So, but they told us what we needed to hear. They were basically like, we've got no reason to leave. There's nowhere better to go. Like they said certain things that gave us a lot of confidence. This lease is not expiring for 2 years as well. So it just made them feel confident to hold on to the asset, and we're going to probably look at renegotiating that lease next year. So you can have those chats with them, and if they said we're out, it's too expensive, or we need more room, then that's actually something we can work with, because we'd go to the tenant, go, all right, do you mind if we start advertising now? And if you find somewhere, you can leave early and we'll basically renegotiate and let you out of the lease earlier, and then we can get the new tenant in. That could save your or your old tenant some money. It might give them the flexibility they needed because they're tied into that lease. They can't walk from it. They're stuck. So if we gave them an option to exit early, if we found another tenant, it's a win-win solution. So we're always trying to find those win-win solutions.
Absolutely. Fair enough. Thank you. Buying commercial property sounds much more complicated, at least to me, much more complicated than purchasing residential property. With residential, we always look for rentability, we look for livability, and bingo, you got a good property. But with commercial, it's quite different. You need to be aware of a multitude of factors that create business potential for the property. I know there are properties, there are locations that they wouldn't render the potential for a good business. Okay, so you need to avoid them. I mean, this complexity of commercial property is perhaps what makes a lot of people sort of unwilling or reluctant to step into that realm. Is that right?
Yeah, 100% correct. Like it is like I mentioned before, there's a higher risk and reward to it. If you're a very green investor and you don't have experience, I think you do need to test yourself out with the ASX or, residential property markets. Like it's a big commitment commercial. And it as of default, that becomes the end game of a lot of people's investment careers. So they want to finish up with commercial. They've bought a few. Like if you've got a successful business and you're earning very good income and you've got the deposits available, commercial will get you. You'll retire quicker on it. Like there's no mathematically, that's just the fact of it. However, if you don't know what you're doing and you don't put the time into it, yeah, you might miss something, and then you'll make a costly mistake, and you're not protected by that kind of homogenous state, which can be viewed as a residential market sometimes. Everything kind of rises and falls at similar periods or similar values over a long period of time. If you look at the capital growth of our top 5 capital cities over the last 40 years, they're all so close to each other. There's no big difference, especially when you sort of average out the yields on top of it for an overall return point of view. Like it's almost the same. And commercial, there's going to be subsectors of the markets because you've got industrial, medical, office. Like right now, we all know office is not going as good in CBDs since COVID because there's less people in an office space. Businesses are more flexible. So we know that sector is going to have more risk in it compared to a medical center in the suburbs. So it's there's a lot of different directions you can go with it, but if you don't know where to start, that's where it can get a little bit tricky.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you. Purchasing commercial property, on the other hand, also calls for more upfront capital, more upfront cash, as banks consider a lower LVR with commercial property. The reason being they most probably consider commercial property riskier, okay, than residential. How can investors go about this one? You made reference to the fact that most of us need to start with residential, and after we got enough equity or we got enough capital, then we can switch over to commercial. Is that the only strategy, or there are other strategies? There are lenders that would go with higher LVR.
So I find the highest LVR they all go to is about 80%. That's a major bank. So there are 80% options. There's no 90%. You can do 100% refinance, of course, if you're sort of pulling equity out of other assets like residential properties. But it is a lower debt world, and look, again, that's one of the reasons less people get into it. It's one of the reasons I like it as well. Like you are up against less competition. That's one of the reasons you're up against a better yield on the average product. So there's no shortcuts. If you do need capital, like I know there's a lot of people out there that say you can do like no money down type situations or vendor finances, and like yes, you can pull off those types of things, but they're low percentage plays. Like you can go to vendors and say, would you finance my deposit? Yeah, sure, maybe 1 in 1,000 might humor it, but then you've got a very high interest scenario on the deposit, and it just gets a lot more complicated. Like I'm from the real world. I like just telling you what you can and can't do. It's simpler that way. You're not going to be led up a garden path, but factor on a 30% deposit. That's the best way. Your minimum deposits for quality property, it's probably going to be around 250 grand you need. That could come in equity or cash, and that'll allow you to buy, a property, it's 5, 6, 7, 800K type property. And that's a capital city warehouse or a shop front or, little, medical type asset. Like they're good properties and they'll have a 3 to 5 year lease on it. The returns are quite strong, and you'll get capital growth out of it. Like that's one of the big myths, that you will get almost the same capital growth out of commercial as resi. You would have got more in the last 2 years, to be honest, as well. Like commercial markets have gone through the roof, and it's just because there's more people coming into this space fighting over limited stock. So like everything in economics, it's supply over demand, which dictates the price. And there's a couple of other small factors that come into it. So right now the demand is outstripping supply of good assets. So there is growth, and that's a protection for the investor as well. You're going to get growth, not just cash flow.
Definitely. On the other hand, commercial property seems to be more susceptible to economic shocks or economic factors that are most of the time beyond our control. So what can one do about this? I know at some time in the past, your strategy was to buy sort of depression-proof commercial properties, such as doctor's office. Are there any other types of commercial property that would be recession-proof or economic shock-proof?
Yeah, look, good question. I've my last few purchases, well, three out of my last four have been neighborhood shopping centers. So I like the small supermarket model. Like my last purchase that I'm currently under contract, it's got an Audi, an IGA, a childcare, a medical center, a pharmacy, a news agency, and a couple of other small shops. So, childcares, they're going to do well in most economic environments. Supermarkets, people have got to eat. The medical center, people are going to get sick. Like these are not going to really fluctuate much in the economy if there's a big recession. If anything, they may even do better. So they're almost counter-cyclical in nature. If you're buying an absolute top of the line office space with, penthouse arrangement with views of a harbour, and the economy takes a massive hit, no doubt you've overpaid for that in the good times. And then when the poor times are here, there'll be a discount needed to find a buyer. So it's asset specific, like you mentioned, but it's all about just purchase properties that are the big buzzword since COVID hit was what was it? It was essential service. That's the one they all use. Essential service businesses are kind of the ones you want to look for. Yeah, like a lawyer, a mortgage broker, accountants. There's many professional services that will operate in any economy, and if you want to sort of de-risk the situation, target those types of tenants.
And they're pandemic proof as well.
Exactly.
Given the fact that we might going to have more pandemics in the future.
Yeah, it's look at that way, and you don't want to be sort of caught with those types of properties where you don't get rent for 6 months because the government may not always bail us out like they did previously, because it was a bit of a free ride with how it all got handled for a lot of business. So, it kept a lot of businesses afloat, which was good. But there's now pain in those sort of weaker sectors, which are starting to flow through. But the stronger ones are just, leapfrogging ahead.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Scott. There are lots of things in this world I'm not sure about, but one thing I'm absolutely sure of is Scott and his partner can be a good recipe for success because their background, what they have accomplished shows, they have gone through the right path. Thank you very much indeed for your presence and for your insights today. And I hope we'll hear more of your beautiful success stories in the future.
Thanks, Shapur. Really appreciate your time, buddy. Thank you.
Thank you.